You're sitting in a darkened movie theater in 1939, watching a little girl with pigtails dance across the screen, her face beaming with joy. You're laughing, you're enchanted, you're in love with the magic of Hollywood. But what if I told you that behind that innocent smile was a nightmare so horrific that it would make your blood run cold? What if I told you that the very people who should have protected these children were the ones destroying them? Welcome to the dark underbelly of old Hollywood, where the American dream became a living nightmare, and where the cruelest villains weren't the ones on screen, they were the ones waiting backstage. This is the story of the parents who betrayed their children for fame, fortune, and their own twisted desires. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll never look at classic Hollywood the same way again. Hollywood has always sold us a fantasy. The glittering premieres, the standing ovations, the adoring fans screaming your name. It's the ultimate dream, especially for a child. But dreams have a dark side, and nowhere was that darkness more apparent than in the golden age of cinema, when children were turned into commodities and their parents became their worst enemies. These weren't just stage parents pushing their kids a little too hard. These were monsters who saw dollar signs instead of daughters, investments instead of sons. They stole, they manipulated, they abused, and in the most horrific cases, they killed. What you're about to hear isn't just Hollywood gossip or tabloid speculation. These are documented cases of cruelty that changed laws, sparked movements, and left scars that would never heal. So buckle up, because we're about to pull back the curtain on some of the most disturbing parent-child relationships in entertainment history. Let's start with the case that literally changed the law. Jackie Coogan was Hollywood's first major child star, adorable little boy who captured America's heart in Charlie Chaplin's The Kid in 1921. By the age of 10, Jackie Coogan wasn't just famous, he was rich beyond imagination. We're talking about a child who earned between $3 and $4 million in the 1920s. To put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of over $90 million in today's money. $90 million earned by a child who couldn't even legally sign a contract. Jackie's father Jack and his mother Lillian were appointed as his business managers. They posed for photographs, they posted a $100,000 bond, they promised the courts and the public that they would protect their son's fortune. They smiled for the cameras and assured everyone that little Jackie's future was secure. It was all a lie. Jackie continued working through his childhood and teenage years, believing that when he turned 21, he would inherit a fortune that would set him up for life. He had plans. He wanted to invest, to produce his own films, to build on the legacy he had created. But when Jackie Coogan celebrated his 21st birthday in 1935, he made a horrifying discovery. The money was gone. Not just some of it. All of it. $4 million vanished. His mother and stepfather, Arthur Bernstein, whom his mother had married after Jackie's father died in a car accident, had spent every single penny. They had lived lavishly while Jackie worked like a dog. Expensive cars, luxurious homes, extravagant parties, all funded by the sweat of a child who had been working since he was 6 years old. When Jackie confronted his mother, her response was so cold, so calculated, so utterly devoid of maternal love that it shocked even the jaded Hollywood insiders. Lillian Coogan looked her son in the eye and said, quote, "No promises were ever made to give Jackie anything. Every dollar a kid earns before he is 21 belongs to his parents. Jackie will not get a cent of his earnings." Let that sink in. A mother openly declaring that she had every right to steal her child's entire fortune because the law said she could. And technically, she was right. In 1930s California, there was no legal protection for child actors' earnings. Parents could take everything, and there was nothing their children could do about it. Jackie was devastated, but he wasn't broken. In 1938, at the age of 23, Jackie Coogan did something revolutionary. He sued his own mother and stepfather. The case became a media sensation. Newspapers across the country covered every detail of the trial. The public was outraged. How could a mother do this to her own child? The courtroom became a battleground, with Jackie's attorneys presenting evidence of the massive earnings he had generated and his mother's lawyers arguing that she had done nothing illegal. And they were right. She hadn't. That was the problem. The trial dragged on, and when it finally concluded, Jackie won. Sort of. After legal fees and negotiations, Jackie Coogan, who had earned $4 million as a child, walked away with just $126,000. But Jackie's lawsuit did something more important than recover a fraction of his stolen money. It sparked outrage that led to real change. In 1939, California passed the California Child Actors Bill, better known as the Coogan Law. For the first time, child actors' earnings were protected. The law required that a portion of a child's earnings be set aside in a blocked trust account that parents couldn't touch. It wasn't perfect, and it would be strengthened and amended many times over the years, but it was a start. Jackie Coogan's nightmare had created a shield for future generations. But the damage to Jackie was irreversible. He would later reconcile with his mother, though things were never the same. His advice to future child stars was stark and haunting: stay away from others. Jackie's story shows us something crucial about Hollywood's exploitation of children. It wasn't just the studios. It wasn't just the directors or producers. Often, the cruelest exploitation came from the people who were supposed to love them most. And Jackie Coogan's case was just the beginning. If Jackie Coogan's story was about financial theft, then Judy Garland's story was about something even more insidious: the systematic destruction of a child's body and mind by the very people who should have nurtured her. Judy Garland, born Frances Ethel G., was pushed onto the vaudeville stage before she could barely walk. Her mother, Ethel Marion Milne, was a frustrated performer who saw her daughters as her ticket to the spotlight she had always craved. Ethel wasn't just a stage mother. She was a tyrant who controlled every aspect of Judy's life with an iron fist wrapped in a smile for the cameras. From the age of 2, little Frances was performing with her sisters as the Gum Sisters, touring vaudeville circuits across America. While other children were playing with toys, Frances was learning choreography. While other children were making friends at school, Frances was being dragged from theater to theater, town to town, never settling anywhere long enough to have a normal childhood. But it was when MGM signed Judy at age 13 that the real horror began. And her mother was complicit in every bit of it. Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, had a vision for his teenage star. She needed to be perfect, flawless, eternally youthful. There was just one problem. Judy was a normal, healthy teenage girl with a normal, healthy appetite. To the studio executives, this was unacceptable. So they put her on a diet. But not just any diet. They gave her pills. Amphetamines to keep her energized during the grueling 18-hour shooting days. Barbiturates to help her sleep at night when the amphetamines wouldn't wear off. Diet pills to keep her weight down. And her mother, Ethel Milne, handed her daughter those pills every single morning. She stood by and watched as the studio doctors pumped her teenage daughter full of drugs that would addict her for life. Judy would later call her mother the real Wicked Witch of the West, a reference to her most famous role in The Wizard of Oz. And it's no wonder. Ethel was more than complicit in her daughter's abuse. She was an active participant. She prioritized Judy's career and the money it brought in over her daughter's health, happiness, and well-being. The pills weren't the only abuse Judy suffered. She was constantly told she was ugly, that her nose was too big, that her teeth were crooked, that she was fat. MGM executives called her their little hunchback behind her back. And through it all, her mother pushed her to work harder, smile brighter, sing louder. There was no escape, no safe haven, no one to protect her. Ethel had sold her daughter's childhood for Hollywood stardom, and the price Judy paid was devastating. By her 20s, Judy Garland was a full-blown drug addict. She had been conditioned to depend on pills to function, to control her weight, to manage her emotions. She would struggle with addiction for the rest of her life, going through multiple stays in psychiatric facilities, multiple marriages, and multiple career collapses. She was haunted by anxiety, depression, and the trauma of a childhood stolen by the very woman who gave birth to her. Judy Garland died at age 47 from an accidental overdose of barbiturates. Her life was a tragedy, and at the center of that tragedy was a mother who chose fame over her daughter's well-being. Ethel Milne never apologized, never acknowledged the harm she had caused. She died believing she had done right by her daughter, that pushing Judy into stardom was an act of love. But Judy knew better, and she never forgave her mother. Now, let's talk about one of the most famous cases of parental abuse in Hollywood history, a case so shocking that it spawned a best-selling book and a cult classic film. Joan Crawford was one of the biggest stars of Hollywood's golden age, an icon of glamour and sophistication. But behind closed doors, according to her daughter Christina, Joan Crawford was a monster. Christina Crawford's 1978 memoir Mommie Dearest painted a portrait of her adoptive mother that shattered Joan's carefully cultivated public image. The book detailed years of physical and psychological abuse, of a mother who flew into terrifying rages over the smallest infractions. The most infamous incident involved wire hangers. According to Christina, Joan had a pathological hatred of wire hangers in her closet. One night, Joan discovered wire hangers in Christina's closet and flew into a violent rage, beating her daughter while screaming, "No wire hangers ever." It sounds almost absurd, but Christina's accounts went far deeper than wire hangers. She described a childhood of unpredictable violence, of being beaten with coat hangers and brushes, of being denied food as punishment, of living in constant fear. Joan Crawford, according to her daughter, was an alcoholic who took out her frustrations and insecurities on the children she had adopted. Christina and her brother Christopher were subjected to psychological torture, being told they were ungrateful, that they should be thankful Joan had rescued them from orphanages, that they owed her everything. Joan controlled every aspect of their lives, from their clothes to their friends to their thoughts. Any sign of rebellion was met with swift and brutal punishment. The abuse was compounded by Joan's need to maintain her public image. To the outside world, Joan Crawford was a devoted mother who had opened her heart and home to children in need. Magazine spreads showed her baking cookies with Christina and Christopher, reading them bedtime stories, playing happy families. But Christina would later reveal that these photo shoots were staged performances, that the moment the cameras left, the mask came off and the real Joan emerged. A controlling, abusive tyrant who saw her children as extensions of her own ego rather than human beings with their own needs and feelings. When Joan Crawford died in 1977, she had her revenge on Christina one final time. In her will, Joan wrote, "It is my intention to make no provision herein for my daughter Christina or my son Christopher, as they have been provided for during my lifetime." She disinherited them completely. But Christina had the last word. 1 year after Joan's death, Mommie Dearest was published and became an immediate bestseller. The book sparked fierce debate. Joan's defenders, including her other children and her longtime secretary, insisted that Christina was lying, that Joan had been strict but never abusive. But Christina stood by every word, and the book resonated with countless adult children of abusive parents who finally saw their own experiences validated. In 1981, Mommie Dearest was adapted into a film starring Faye Dunaway, and while the movie became a camp classic, often laughed at for its over-the-top performances, the real story beneath it was no laughing matter. It was the story of a child trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape the one person who should have loved her unconditionally. If these stories are making you uncomfortable, I need to warn you that we're about to enter even darker territory. Because what we've discussed so far is abuse, exploitation, and cruelty. What comes next is murder. Judith Barsi was one of the most recognizable child voices of the 1980s. If you grew up in that era, you knew her work even if you didn't know her name. She voiced Ducky in The Land Before Time, saying that iconic line, "Yep, yep, yep." She was Anne-Marie in All Dogs Go to Heaven. She appeared in dozens of commercials and television shows. By the age of 10, Judith Barsi had earned over $100,000, and she was on the verge of major stardom. She should have had a long and successful career ahead of her. Instead, she was dead before her 11th birthday, murdered by her own father in a crime so horrific it shocked even hardened Hollywood insiders. Judith's father, Joseph Barsi, was a Hungarian immigrant who had come to America with dreams of success. But Joseph was a failure, a man who drank heavily and couldn't hold down a job. As his daughter's career took off, Joseph's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. He was abusive to both Judith and her mother, Maria. He would fly into alcoholic rages, threatening them with violence, making their home a place of terror. Judith began showing signs of severe stress. She started pulling out her own eyelashes and eyebrows, a classic sign of extreme anxiety in children. She told her friends and teachers that she was afraid her father was going to kill her and her mother. Child Protective Services was contacted. Reports were filed. But in the end, nothing was done. No one saved Judith Barsi. On July 25, 1988, Joseph Barsi decided to make good on his threats. In the early morning hours, while his wife and daughter slept, Joseph took a gun and shot them both in the head. He then poured gasoline throughout the house and set it on fire, attempting to destroy the evidence. 2 days later, Joseph went into the garage, put the gun to his own head, and pulled the trigger. When firefighters discovered the bodies in the burnt-out shell of the Barsi home, the full horror of what had happened became clear. Judith Barsi, a little girl whose voice had brought joy to millions of children, had been murdered by the man who was supposed to protect her. Her mother, Maria, who had tried to leave Joseph multiple times but had been too afraid to follow through, died alongside her daughter. The tragedy sent shockwaves through Hollywood. How had this been allowed to happen? Why hadn't Child Protective Services intervened more aggressively? Why hadn't someone, anyone, saved this little girl? Judith's case led to increased awareness about domestic violence and the need for stronger intervention when children are at risk. But for Judith, it was too late. She was buried alongside her mother, and on her headstone is inscribed a line that breaks your heart: "Our loves lives on with us forever." Yep. 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 Judith Barsi's story is the most extreme example of parental abuse in Hollywood history, but it's also a stark reminder that fame and success mean nothing when a child isn't safe in her own home. Let's shift gears slightly and talk about a different kind of parental abuse, the exploitation and sexualization of children for profit. Brooke Shields became one of the most famous faces in the world when she was still a child, but the path to that fame was paved with decisions that would be considered completely unacceptable today. And behind every one of those decisions was her mother, Terry Shields. Brooke's career began when she was just 11 months old, appearing in an Ivory soap commercial. By age 12, she was starring in Pretty Baby, a film where she played a child prostitute in New Orleans. The role required Brooke, a child, to appear nude on screen. Today, such a film would never be made, and if anyone tried, they would face immediate legal consequences. But in 1978, Terry Shields signed off on her daughter appearing naked in a major motion picture, and the film was released to critical acclaim. It didn't stop there. At age 14, Brooke appeared in Calvin Klein jeans commercials with the now infamous tagline, "You want to know what comes between me and my Calvins? Nothing." The commercials were deliberately sexualized, presenting a teenage girl in provocative poses and situations. Again, Terry Shields approved. She saw nothing wrong with marketing her teenage daughter as a sex symbol. Brooke has spoken in recent years about her complicated relationship with her mother. On one hand, Terry was incredibly protective of Brooke on set, never allowing her to be alone with directors or producers, always maintaining control. But on the other hand, the very roles Terry chose for her daughter were exploitative, sexualizing a child for public consumption. The documentary Pretty Baby, Brooke Shields explores this contradiction, showing how Brooke has had to reconcile her love for her mother with the uncomfortable reality of how she was marketed as a child. Terry Shields died in 2012, and Brooke has been careful in how she discusses her mother's choices. She acknowledges that Terry was a product of her time, a woman who didn't see the harm in what she was doing because she believed she was helping her daughter achieve stardom. But Brooke has also admitted that looking back, some of the decisions made on her behalf were deeply inappropriate. The documentary features Barbara Walters' infamous interview with then-teenage Brooke, where Walters asked about her measurements and made comments about her physical appearance that would be considered completely unacceptable today. Throughout the interview, Terry sits next to her daughter, smiling and nodding, seeing nothing wrong with a grown woman sexualizing her child on national television. Brooke Shields survived her childhood fame relatively intact compared to many of her peers, but the cost was high. She has spoken about struggling with depression, with body image issues, with the pressure of being seen as a sexual object from such a young age. And at the center of it all was a mother who believed she was doing right by her daughter, even as she was putting her in situations no child should ever be in. Now let's talk about the two Coreys, Corey Feldman and Corey Haim. These two child stars dominated the 1980s with films like The Lost Boys, Stand By Me, The Goonies, and License to Drive. They were best friends, inseparable both on and off screen. But behind the scenes, both boys were being abused, and their parents either didn't know or didn't care. Corey Feldman has been one of the most outspoken former child stars when it comes to abuse in Hollywood. He has repeatedly stated that pedophilia is Hollywood's biggest problem and that both he and Corey Haim were sexually abused by multiple men in positions of power during their childhood careers. And where were their parents during all of this? Feldman has described his father as abusive and his mother as neglectful, more interested in the money he was bringing in than his well-being. Corey Haim's situation was even worse. His mother, Judy Haim, was a classic stage parent who pushed her son relentlessly, never giving him the emotional support or protection he desperately needed. As teenagers, both Coreys spiraled into drug addiction, a common refuge for abused children trying to numb their pain. They continued working, continued making movies, but the damage had been done. Corey Haim never recovered. He struggled with addiction for his entire adult life, going through multiple stints in rehab, burning through his money, burning through relationships. He died in 2010 at age 38 from pneumonia, his body ravaged by decades of drug abuse. Feldman believes that Haim's death was a direct result of the abuse he suffered as a child and the lack of protection from his mother. Corey Feldman is still alive and still fighting to expose the predators who abuse children in Hollywood, but he has also been clear about the role parents play in this cycle of abuse. Many parents, he says, knowingly allow their children to be abused because they don't want to jeopardize the income stream. They turn a blind eye to warning signs, they ignore their children's pleas for help, and they prioritize fame and fortune over their children's safety. The two Coreys are a tragic example of what happens when parents fail in their most basic duty, to protect their children. Let's shift to another form of parental abuse, using children as weapons in bitter divorces and custody battles. Natalie Wood was one of the most beautiful and talented actresses in Hollywood history, starring in classics like West Side Story, Rebel Without a Cause, and Miracle on 34th Street. But behind the glamorous image was a deeply troubled woman, and at the root of that trouble was her mother, Maria Zakharenko, who Americanized her name to Maria Gerdin. Maria was the ultimate stage mother, a woman who pushed her daughter into acting before Natalie could even talk. Maria had a pathological attachment to her daughter's career, seeing Natalie not as a child but as her meal ticket and her path to social status. She controlled every aspect of Natalie's life, from her career choices to her relationships. But Maria's abuse went beyond mere control. According to Natalie's sister Lana Wood's memoir, Maria allowed or even facilitated situations where Natalie was put in danger. The most explosive allegation is that Maria allowed a powerful Hollywood actor to sexually assault teenage Natalie, believing that maintaining good relationships with powerful men was essential to her daughter's career. Whether this specific allegation is true remains controversial, but what's undeniable is that Maria prioritized Natalie's career over her safety and emotional well-being. Natalie grew up paranoid and insecure, despite her beauty and talent. She was terrified of water, a fear that her mother had instilled in her through creepy predictions and warnings. Ironically, Natalie Wood would die by drowning in 1981 under mysterious circumstances, a tragedy that remains controversial to this day. Maria lived until 1998, outliving her famous daughter by 17 years. She never publicly acknowledged any wrongdoing, never expressed regret for how she had raised Natalie. To Maria, she had done everything right. She had taken a child and made her a star. That the star was deeply damaged, deeply unhappy, and died young was simply the price of fame. Let's talk about Macaulay Culkin, because his story brings us into more modern times and shows that even with stronger child protection laws, parental abuse still happens. Macaulay Culkin became the biggest child star in the world with Home Alone in 1990. At age 10, he was earning millions of dollars and was the most recognizable child on the planet. And controlling his entire career, his entire life, was his father, Kit Culkin. Kit Culkin was, by all accounts, a nightmare. He was a failed actor who lived vicariously through his son, pushing Macaulay and his siblings relentlessly. Macaulay has described his father as physically and mentally abusive, a man who ruled through fear and intimidation. Kit controlled Macaulay's career with an iron fist, alienating producers and directors with his demands and difficult behavior. He would regularly pull Macaulay and his other working children out of projects if he didn't get his way, using his children as leverage in business negotiations. As Macaulay got older and began to understand what was happening, he fought back. At age 14, Macaulay did something radical. He sued for emancipation from his parents, specifically to get away from his father's control. The court battle was ugly and public, with Kit fighting to maintain control over his son's fortune. Macaulay won his emancipation, gaining legal control over himself and his career. But the damage was done. Macaulay has stated that he hasn't spoken to his father in over 30 years and has no intention of ever reconciling. He has called Kit a narcissist and the worst person he knows. Kit Culkin destroyed his relationship with his son for the sake of control and money, and in doing so, he became another entry in the long list of terrible Hollywood parents. But not all parental abuse is loud and dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet and insidious, a slow poisoning of a child's sense of self. Diana Barrymore, the daughter of the legendary actor John Barrymore, inherited her father's talent and his demons. Both of Diana's parents were alcoholics, and Diana grew up in an environment of chaos and neglect. Her father was largely absent, too consumed by his own career and addictions to be a present parent. Her mother, Michael Strange, was cold and emotionally distant, more interested in her own pursuits than raising her daughter. Diana was essentially raised by nannies and boarding schools, desperate for parental attention and love that never came. She turned to acting, hoping to win her father's approval, but John Barrymore died when Diana was 21, and she never got the validation she craved. Diana spiraled into alcoholism and drug addiction, following the same destructive path as her father. She was married multiple times, each relationship ending in disaster. She wrote a brutally honest memoir called Too Much, Too Soon, detailing her dysfunctional family and her struggles with addiction. Diana Barrymore died at age 38 from an overdose of alcohol and sleeping pills. Her death was ruled accidental, but many believe it was suicide, a final escape from the pain of a life without love or stability. Diana's story is a quieter tragedy than some of the others on this list, but it's no less devastating. She was a victim of parental neglect, of being born into a family that was too damaged, too self-absorbed to give her what she needed. And she paid for that neglect with her life. Carl Switzer is a name you might not recognize, but you definitely know his face. Carl played Alfalfa in the Our Gang comedy shorts, the kid with the cowlick who sang off-key and made millions of children laugh. But Carl Switzer's life after child stardom was anything but funny, and while his parents weren't overtly abusive, their handling of his career and finances set him on a path to tragedy. Carl's parents, Fred and Gladys Switzer, were like many stage parents of that era. They managed their son's career and his money, and while there's no evidence they stole from him the way Jackie Coogan's parents did, they also didn't prepare him for life after stardom. When Carl aged out of the Our Gang series, he found himself unable to transition to adult roles. He was typecast, broke, and struggling to make ends meet. He turned to dog breeding and working as a hunting guide, jobs that barely paid the bills. On January 21, 1959, 31-year-old Carl Switzer got into an argument with a man named Moses Stiltz over a $50 debt related to a lost dog. The argument escalated, and Stiltz shot Carl in the stomach. Carl Switzer died shortly after, killed over $50. The circumstances of his death are disputed. Stiltz claimed self-defense and was never charged, but what's undeniable is that Carl's life had gone tragically wrong after his childhood fame ended. And while his parents didn't abuse him in the traditional sense, their failure to prepare him for life after child stardom contributed to his downfall. They took the money he earned, spent it on the family's lifestyle, and when the work dried up, Carl had nothing to fall back on. His story is a cautionary tale about the importance of proper financial planning and preparation for child stars, lessons that were learned too late for Carl Switzer. Mickey Rooney rounds out our list, and his story is a bit different because the abuse he suffered came not from his parents but from his own children in his old age. But Mickey's story connects to the broader theme of exploitation because Mickey himself was a product of the same child star system that destroyed so many others. Mickey Rooney started performing as a toddler in vaudeville, pushed into show business by his parents. He became one of the biggest stars of the 1930s and 40s, earning millions of dollars over his long career. But Mickey was terrible with money, losing fortunes through gambling, bad investments, and multiple divorces. By the time he reached his 80s, Mickey was nearly broke despite having earned over $12 million during his career. In his final years, Mickey became the victim of elder abuse at the hands of his stepson, Chris Aber, who controlled Mickey's finances and allegedly verbally and financially abused the elderly actor. In 2011, Mickey testified before a Senate committee about elder abuse, describing how he had been exploited and mistreated by family members he trusted. Mickey Rooney died in 2014 at age 93, leaving an estate of only $18,000 despite his decades of stardom. His story comes full circle to Jackie Coogan, a child star whose earnings were mismanaged and stolen, not by his parents but by later family members. Mickey's testimony helped raise awareness about elder abuse in the entertainment industry, showing that exploitation can happen at any age. So what do all these stories tell us? They reveal a pattern of exploitation, abuse, and cruelty that was endemic to old Hollywood's child star system. Parents saw their children as investments, as meal tickets, as extensions of their own failed dreams. Studios saw them as commodities to be used and discarded. And the children themselves? They were voiceless, powerless, and trapped in a system that chewed them up and spit them out. The creation of the Coogan Law was a start, but it wasn't enough. It took decades of advocacy, scandals, and tragedies before meaningful protections were put in place for child actors. Today, there are stricter rules about working hours, mandatory education, financial protections, and on-set supervision. But even now, the system isn't perfect. Child stars still face pressures and dangers that most children never experience, and there are still parents willing to exploit their children for fame and fortune. The stories you've heard today aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings. They're reminders that fame comes with a cost, and that cost is often paid by the most vulnerable among us, children. These kids didn't ask to be famous. They didn't ask to carry the weight of their family's financial security on their tiny shoulders. They just wanted to be loved, to be protected, to be children. And their parents failed them in the most fundamental way possible. Some of these children survived and went on to live fulfilling lives, though always carrying the scars of their childhoods. Others weren't so lucky. They turned to drugs, to alcohol, to destructive relationships, trying to fill the void left by parents who chose fame over love. And some, like Judith Barsi, didn't survive at all. But here's something interesting, something that might surprise you after all these horror stories. Not every child star had terrible parents. There were good parents in old Hollywood, parents who protected their children, who prioritized their well-being over money and fame. Shirley Temple's mother, Gertrude, was protective of her daughter and managed her finances responsibly. Shirley Temple grew up to be a well-adjusted adult who spoke fondly of her mother and her childhood. Roddy McDowell's parents were supportive and caring, helping him navigate child stardom without losing his sense of self. Ron Howard, who started as a child actor and went on to become a successful director, credits his parents with keeping him grounded and protected. These examples show that it was possible to be a good parent in Hollywood. It just required putting your child's needs above your own desires. The legacy of old Hollywood's cruelest parents lives on in the protections and awareness we have today. Every time a child actor's earnings are placed in a Coogan account, every time a social worker checks in on a child on set, every time working hours are monitored and enforced, it's because of the Jackie Coogans and Judy Garlands who suffered so others wouldn't have to. Their pain wasn't meaningless. It led to change. But we can never forget the cost. We can never forget the childhood stolen, the lives destroyed, the dreams crushed by the people who should have been protectors. These weren't just bad parents. They were criminals, abusers, and in the worst cases, murderers. They deserve to be remembered not as the parents of stars, but as cautionary tales, as examples of what happens when greed and ambition are valued over love and responsibility. As we close out this deep dive into Hollywood's darkest secrets, I want you to think about something. These stories took place decades ago, in a different era with different values and different laws. But child exploitation didn't end with old Hollywood. It still happens today, in different forms and different contexts. Child influencers on social media, child athletes pushed beyond their limits, child performers in countries with weak labor protections, they're all at risk. The names and faces change, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same: adults with power exploiting children for profit. And often, the adults doing the exploiting are the parents themselves. So here's the twist ending I promised you, the surprise that changes everything. The cruelest parents in old Hollywood history weren't aberrations. They weren't monsters who came out of nowhere. They were products of a system that valued profit over people, fame over family, and success over safety. And that system still exists. It's been reformed, it's been improved, but it hasn't been eliminated. As long as there's money to be made from children's talents, there will be adults willing to exploit them. As long as fame is seen as the ultimate achievement, there will be parents willing to sacrifice their children on its altar. The story of old Hollywood's cruelest parents isn't a story about the past. It's a warning about the present and the future. It's a reminder that we must remain vigilant, that we must continue to strengthen protections for child performers, and that we must never forget the lessons learned from these tragedies. Jackie Coogan taught us that children's earnings must be protected. Judy Garland taught us that physical and mental health matter more than perfect performances. Judith Barsi taught us that warning signs must be taken seriously. Joan Crawford taught us that speaking truth to power, even about your own parents, is an act of courage. And all of them together taught us that childhood is precious, fleeting, and irreplaceable, and that no amount of fame or fortune is worth stealing it away. These were the cruelest parents in old Hollywood history, but they were also involuntary martyrs to a cause they never chose. Their suffering created the protections that exist today, and their stories serve as eternal reminders of what happens when we fail to protect our most vulnerable. Remember their names. Remember their stories. And never let it happen again.